Hello there, students. It's Professor Bridget, and this is going to be your first lecture for your Intro to Biology class. So it seems fitting that we'll start at Chapter 1 with some of the basics, some of the themes in biology. So this will be one of the topics that we discuss right here, and then we'll quickly go over just the basics of the ideas behind evolution. And then at the end, there are a few slides regarding the process of science. And then we won't cover that. If you guys want to read about biology and everyday life, there are some great short stories or short, what would you call it? Short, I guess they're just paragraphs that share some neat things with you. Okay? So let's get started. We'll skip this slide. All right, so one of the themes in biology is that all forms of life have some pretty common things that they share. So whether you're a single-celled amoeba or a paramecium or a brown bear, actually a grizzly bear like you see here, or a lemur or a giraffe or a cat or a dog, whatever the case may be, that all living organisms share these 7 things. So first off, we'll just go in order here. We'll start with number 1, that there's an order to the assemblage of living organisms. It's not just a bunch of things, atoms, molecules, just kind of all clumped together. There's a very precise order, and we're going to go over that order in a second, but I'll just say it here, that atoms come together to make molecules, molecules come together to create organelles inside of a cell, and then finally you're at this level of organization where you have just one single cell, and then many cells come together to make tissues, at least in higher organisms. Tissues come together to make organs, organs come together to make organ systems, and then at least in humans anyway, there are 11 total organ systems that come together to create the whole organism. So there's this very distinct organization of living organisms. The second one then is reproduction. In order to be able to pass on your DNA to the next generation, there must be some form for that organism to reproduce. Doesn't have to be sexual reproduction. A sperm doesn't have to get together with an egg. It can be as simple as something called binary fission, where a single cell just splits in two, essentially making a clone of itself. But that's another thing that all living organisms do. Additionally, we all need to be able to grow and develop, right? We didn't begin life as trillions of cells. We began life as one single cell. When a sperm came together with an egg, that created a single-celled structure called a zygote. And through this amazing process called mitosis, that cell grew and divided and grew and divided and grew and divided. And all those cells continued to grow and divide and get more specific, right? So you started out as like one little cell that wasn't a muscle cell or a nerve cell, but over the course of the growing and dividing, those cells gradually became more specific, more specialized to do a particular job. So all organisms need to do that. The fourth thing is energy processing. This one's kind of intuitive maybe, that we need to be able to take in energy or food, process that, break that food down into tiny molecules that are small enough to get into our bloodstream, and then be pumped all around the body. And then waste products, of course, need to be removed. So that would be energy processing. So that was number 4. Move on to number 5. All organisms need to be able to respond to their environment. Now, the way in which different organisms do this is totally dependent on what their needs are. But say, for instance, you're out in the hot California sun, especially this week, you're in that hot California sun, and you feel yourself getting too hot. You'll respond to your environment by moving into the shade or getting into your car and turning the air conditioning on or what have you. This is a good example that your book has given you here. That's a Venus flytrap, And what it's doing is responding to stimulation of these little finger-like structures that you see here in order to capture its prey. So that's another example of responding to the environment. And then 6, regulation. All living organisms need the ability to regulate internal activities, things that are happening inside of their body. It could be like for you and I, regulating our body temperature, maintaining a body temperature of 98.6. It could be a single-celled organism regulating some sort of metabolic process or some process happening inside the cell where chemical reactions are happening. So we all have the ability to regulate functions that are occurring in our body. And then lastly, number 7, all organisms have the ability to evolve. They all evolve over time, making very, very, very small changes along the way. Some organisms do it faster than others. Some do it very, 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 very slowly. But those are the 7 things that all living organisms must share. And we're going to go over these things. The first thing that we're going to do in Chapter 2 is we're going to learn a little bit about chemistry and how atoms come together to make molecules, and which molecules are important for what are the major molecules inside of our living cells. We'll learn about how individual cells reproduce themselves, both for growth and development, but also for genetic variation. We'll learn about processes like photosynthesis and cellular respiration, these processes at the cellular level that process energy. We won't talk too much about responding to the environment. That's kind of beyond the scope of what we have time for. We'll talk a little bit about regulation as well later on in the semester, and then we'll definitely cover evolution. So those are kind of the main themes that are not just the main themes in biology, but the themes that we're going to kind of stick to throughout our course. So it gives you a little idea where we're going. So we just discussed that all living organisms share some common properties, so 7 properties. What's neat is that as we move up the hierarchy of organization, or up from the smallest components making a living organism all the way up to the whole organism, we see new properties or new things that become apparent or emerge. I'll go over some of these with you in a second. And I apologize, we lost some of the formatting when I transferred this PowerPoint to the program that I use. But let's just look at how we've got this organization in living organisms. And we're going to start below the living organism level. We'll start below the cellular level. So right here is the cellular level. Let's look at how each one of these little balls that you see here would be one single atom of some element. Those atoms come together to make molecules. Those molecules come together to make the tiny structures inside of a cell that carry out the cell's daily activities. Those are called organelles. And then many organelles come together to make a single cell. This octopus-like looking structure right here is actually a nerve cell. And we'll talk more about those a little bit later. Then you would have many cells. If we're talking about nervous tissue, or nerve cells, you might have many nerve cells that all come together to create nervous tissue. And what would be nervous tissue? That'd be like your brain or your spinal cord. Those tissues, let's say again, if we're still just talking about nerve cells, we've got nerve tissue that like I just mentioned, will organize into larger organs. And then you may have many of those organs then combining to create the whole nervous system, or this whole organ system. So along with the brain and the spinal cord, you've also got what are called cranial nerves and peripheral nerves. You've also got some other structures scattered out throughout your body that are part of the nervous system. And that nervous system is just one system that comes together to create this whole organism. Let's say, for instance, another example, at least in this lemur anyway, would be the cardiovascular system. That includes your heart and blood vessels. The urinary system, which includes the bladder and the structures that carry urine out of the body. So you have all of those organ systems come together to make a whole organism. Then many organisms come together, I'm sorry, we lost this formatting, come together to make up a population. So let's say you're one organism, but you make up the population, you're one individual in the population that is your neighborhood, for instance. And then many populations, different populations, come together to make communities. So this might be your neighborhood, the surrounding neighborhoods in the town that you live in. That would be your community, right? And then many different communities come together to make an ecosystem. So for you, for example, all of the cities in Southern California make up the Southern California ecosystem, right? In this case, an ecosystem would be something like a forest, or a coral reef, or the tundra is an ecosystem. The bare, cold, snowy regions at either one of the poles. And then many different ecosystems come together then to create what we call a biosphere. So this might be one single country, like Madagascar, for instance, would be a biosphere. Okay, let's have a look at some of these emergent properties. That's kind of where we started anyways, right? So at each one of those levels of organization, there are these different properties that become apparent or that emerge. So at every step in that hierarchy of life, you have these new things kind of appearing. So remember, cells come together to make tissues. Tissues come together to make organs. Organs come together to make organ systems. And then lastly, you can say it with me, many organ systems come together to make an organism. So I've given you a couple of examples. At each one of these levels of organization, you'll see different properties come out. So water, think about a water molecule. One water molecule is very different than trillions of molecules that come together to make up your glass of water. One individual molecule doesn't have properties of that are the same as trillions of water molecules. So one water molecule might exist just in the air. Trillions of water molecules that have come together in an organized fashion make a cup of water. One bird, for instance, kind of goes about its daily business and does its own thing. But as you get a flock of birds together, or you could say a whole population of birds, then behavior can sometimes change. Think about birds that are migratory. Now, not all birds are migratory, but let's say Canadian geese, for example. They get together, and when they're on their migratory routes, they act more as a group than individuals. If you think about consciousness and all of your thoughts, all your memories, all of the things that make you you, they're all begin with these specialized cells. I'm drawing a nerve cell here, right? So that's one of the cells in your brain or the spinal cord. Now, one nerve cell can only do so much. It can process information, but having one nerve cell definitely doesn't give you consciousness. You need to have trillions, or I shouldn't say trillions, billions of nerve cells all coming together to create a brain that gives you or allows you to be conscious of your surroundings and think and remember and learn and progress. And then if you think of you, think about your body is made of trillions of cells. So one muscle cell, for instance, just one individual muscle cell can only really do one thing. It can contract. It gets shorter. But if you think about all of the muscle cells in all of your muscles themselves, they come together inside to make up your whole muscular system. And that muscular system transports you from one place to the next, or helps you exercise, helps you carry out digestion of food, and so on. But in addition to that, your nerve cells, your connective tissue cells, other types of cells called epithelial cells, they all come together to create this whole individual, this whole organism that is you. Whereas if you just took any one of those cells all on their own, you wouldn't have a human being, right? So as you go up this ladder of organization, you see different properties kind of pop out. So I've kind of already mentioned this, but I'm just going to say it again, that cells are the smallest unit of life. So an amoeba or a paramecium would be single-celled organisms. Those are the smallest things that can do all of those things that living organisms need to do. And remember, at the beginning of the lecture, living organisms must be able to regulate their internal environment. They need to be able to process energy. They need to respond to their environment. So that might be like going towards food or away from a predator or what have you. They need to develop or grow, and then also maintain their organization. Even at the cellular level, cells and the molecules on the inside need to maintain their order to function properly. And then reproduction. Even single cells need to be able to reproduce. All living organisms have to have the ability to reproduce, otherwise they will not pass on their genetic information to the next generation. So that was just a little repeat. Now what I'd like to talk to you about is the relationship between structure and function. The structure would be like the way something is put together or the way it looks, and function is how it works. So in a second, I'm going to show you how this relationship between structure and function is visible everywhere you look, if you're just conscious that it exists. So we're going to start off at the cellular level. I know we're kind of jumping around here a little bit, but one of the things I like to point out to my students is that if you've had a high school biology course or some other biology course in the past, we're all kind of trained to think of cells as just like this nice circular structure, when in fact only a few cells actually are circular, right? They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. But regardless of the type of cell, all cells have to be surrounded by what we call a membrane, and that'll be one of the major topics that we hit in a few weeks here. But like, let me just outline this one cell for you here. It kind of looks like a fried egg. That's a cheek cell. And so that would be surrounded by a membrane, a molecular membrane. So you really can't see obviously the molecules, but you can see that there's a line around this cell. That's the membrane. And that membrane holds all of the components of the cell on the inside, but also regulates what can go into the cell and be exchanged with its surroundings. So, for instance, I don't know, that membrane might regulate the amount of water that goes into the cell and may also regulate the amount of water that leaves, right? So that membrane isn't just a structure that encloses all the components, it regulates the internal environment of the cell. This is a red blood cell. Just kind of neat. It's got this concave feature right there for a specific reason. And then these are bacteria cells, so those are a little bit more rod-like. As far as cells go, there are two basic types of cells. So this one is called, the top one is called prokaryotic, and then the bottom we say eukaryotic. So pro in Latin, that just means first. So prokaryotic cells are what we understand to have evolved first. They're very simple, and they're usually much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And then let me just introduce eukaryotic cells to you, and then I'll show you some other things regarding them. So eukaryotic cells are cells that we know evolved after prokaryotic cells. They're much more complex than prokaryotic cells. And every one of the little organs on the inside is surrounded by a membrane. So these are what we call membrane enclosed organelles. And also there's a membrane-bound nucleus that has the DNA. Prokaryotic cells don't have these things. They just have all of their components kind of scattered within the cell itself. But with eukaryotic cells, each individual structure is compartmentalized or bound or surrounded by a membrane. And examples of eukaryotic cells would be plants, animals, fungi. And an example of a eukaryotic cell would be like singular would be bacterium. Bacteria would be plural. So those are the two main types. Let's look at a picture. And I struggle with this picture from your authors because it's just so basic, and it just doesn't do much to help students understand kind of what they're trying to say here. But there is a link, there's a YouTube link that explains prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells pretty well. So over on the upper right, this is a prokaryotic cell. See how much smaller it is than the eukaryotic cell? Now it does have a membrane that surrounds it, right? So that keeps everything together. But these structures right here, they did a really bad job. Let's say this is the DNA. So you would have like strands of DNA. It would not be surrounded by a membrane. And then, I don't know, let's just say this is some other organelle inside that cell. It still, again, wouldn't be surrounded by a membrane. And if you consider that cell versus a eukaryotic cell, look at just the size is bigger, right? Here would be the eukaryotic cell's nucleus, this big purple structure in the center, and then you would have the DNA kind of bound up inside of that nucleus and contained inside of that nucleus. And the same is true for these little structures right here. Let's say this is a protein making factory. Proteins are made inside, and that's going to be surrounded by a membrane bound, that is going to be surrounded by a membrane. So we're going to move on to another topic that I really want you guys to keep in mind throughout the entire course. And that's the relationship between structure and function. And remember, structure is the way something is put together, or its shape, or what it looks like. And then function is how it works. We see this relationship between structure and function everywhere you look, not just at the cellular level or at the organism level. You see it in everything everywhere around you, and I'll give you some examples here in a second. Let me explain this relationship though first. So something has a particular structure in part because that structure carries out a specific function. But also you may be able to say, well, something has a specific function because it has this structure. So it's a relationship where you can't really separate structure and function. Is something a specific structure because it does something specific, or does it do something specific because it has that structure? We often think of this relationship as two sides of the same coin. And this was recognized, it's been recognized for hundreds of years, but even architects recognize this relationship in the buildings that they design. So a famous architect that you guys might know is Frank Lloyd Wright. And what he said about form and function is that form or structure follows function, meaning something has a specific structure because it does something specific. He goes, you know what, that's been misunderstood. Form and function should be one joined in a spiritual union. What he's trying to say is that they should be two sides of the same coin, that you can't separate structure from function. For those of you that are going on into an anatomy course, this is going to be a huge theme throughout the entire course. I promise you that. I teach anatomy myself. I emphasize this from day one. So I always want you guys, when we're learning about a topic, I really want you to think about, okay, what does this thing look like? What does it do? And always ask yourself that and always know that. That'll prepare you really well for going into anatomy. Anatomy is the study of structure. You'll also have to take human physiology. Well, physiology is the study of function. So we separate those two things into two separate courses, but you'll learn a little bit about physiology in anatomy. And in physiology, you'll learn a little bit about anatomy. It's impossible to teach either one of those courses without talking about structure and or function. Let me give you an example. So in an anatomy course, for instance, if we didn't include some of the function, it would be really difficult to understand what it is we're studying. So the heart, for example. If we were on the cardiovascular system and I were to be teaching an anatomy class and just tell you what the heart looks like and the structures that are present, but not tell you what the heart does, that wouldn't be a complete understanding of the heart itself. Now, you can kind of see that you can't talk about the heart without talking about what the heart does, right? And when you get to physiology, you wouldn't be able to learn about what the heart does without knowing a little bit about what it looks like. So really kind of difficult to separate those two things. So I'll give you examples here, even at the molecular level. So not even at the cellular level, but just the molecular level, we see this relationship between structure and function. So the example I'm giving you here is an enzyme, and we'll learn about enzymes later on in the course. But this little Pac-Man, this little circle with the pie cut out, is the enzyme. And you see it has a really specific shape. The function of an enzyme is to carry out or help chemical reactions. And the way that they do this is they kind of bind or dock with another molecule. And where that docking occurs or that binding occurs is at a place we call the active site. So look at the shape of that active site. That active site is perfectly shaped for this triangular molecule to come in and dock or bind with that enzyme, and then a chemical reaction gets carried out. Obviously, the rectangle is not going to fit in there properly, and the circle won't fit in there. And therefore, this enzyme can't work on those molecules. It can't carry out chemical reactions with those molecules. It can only carry out a chemical reaction with a molecule that fits in its active site. So the shape of both the enzyme here and what we call its substrate is really important for carrying out the function of this chemical reaction. So even at the below the cellular level, this isn't even a living level yet, you see that relationship between structure and function. We see it very clearly at the cellular level. Early in the lecture, I said, hey, every biology book shows you this kind of generic cell that's round with a nucleus in the center and all the organelles spaced out perfectly inside the cell. Well, the reason biology books do this is because they're just trying to be, like I said, really general, really generic. I shouldn't say there aren't very many, but many cells don't have this shape. They have very different shapes because they carry out very different functions. This right here, that's a human sperm. That's one single cell. And look how different that shape is versus the round cell that you see. The shape of the sperm is designed to make it hydrodynamic or have the ability to swim through body fluids to get to fertilize an egg. It's got this little torpedo shape also to minimize drag and friction. And it's got this little tail at the end to provide propulsion. So that shape of that cell tells you a whole lot about what its function is. And then over on the right, this whole thing is a nerve cell. So very different looking than the cell that you see over on the left, that's circular. The function of nerve cells is communication, to get information from one area to the next. So one of the really neat things I like about nerve cells is that they have a receiving end. So this is where they would receive information at these little branch-like structures right here. And then once they receive that information is processed by the big boss in the center, the nucleus. And then the cell generates this electrical signal that travels down the length of this long structure and out to here. So it's carrying information across some distance. And then there would be another nerve cell waiting with its branches here to receive that information. And it would have a long extension also. So you see that information transfer occurs from the number 1 cell down to the number 2 cell. There might be another nerve cell waiting right here to receive that information. So you can see how that structure correlates directly with the function of transmitting information from one area to the next. It's a really cool relationship we see at the cellular level, and it's one we also see at the organ level. I sometimes ask my students, what are the organs of the muscular system? Remember, organs come together to make organ systems. The muscular system is an organ system. So a lot of times I just kind of get blank stares and nobody really knows how to answer. And I can see that because when we think of organs, we usually think of like the stomach or the small intestines or the pancreas or what have you. But all 630 muscles in the human body, each one is an organ. And look at how this picture right here is showing you how muscles come in a variety of shapes. They are not all the same shape. They have pretty much the same function as the muscles contract or get shorter and then pull on a bone to make movement. But the way they pull on a bone to create movement is going to vary based on the muscle's structure. So this muscle right here would be like the pectoralis major muscle. Look how different its shape is versus this muscle here called orbicularis oris. That's a muscle that you find right around the lips. So your pectoralis major muscle does a different action or carries out a different action than that muscle that is around your lips, right? This type of muscle arrangement you'll find at body openings. These are called sphincter muscles. And so when their fibers contract or when the muscle itself contracts, that opening gets smaller. And then when that muscle relaxes, the opening gets larger. Whereas this muscle right here, the pectoralis major muscle, all of its individual parts are kind of going in different directions. That's going to be more of a, that muscle is going to get shorter from here to here. So you'll get this distance, you'll get this distance being shorter, kind of like an accordion as that muscle contracts and pulls on a bone. So it's a different movement. But my point is that even at the organ level, you see this difference in structure that's going to lead to a difference in function. We see it at the organ system level. So this would be the skeletal system. And if we compare the skeletal systems or a part of the skeletal systems of different animals that are clearly, they look different, they have totally different habitats, they behave differently, we see similarities and we see differences. And the differences really just represent the different things or the different ways in which these animals interact with their environment. So you've got a crocodile, a bird, whale, a horse, a bat, and a human. And these are all the forelimbs. So this would be the front leg of a crocodile, the wings of a bird, the pectoral fin on a whale, the front leg of a horse, the wing of a bat, and then your arm. And you see obviously that there are structural differences, and those structural differences then create functional differences. So birds have wings, right? And so they function to put the bird in the air and keep that bird aloft. Well, ours look different than those birds, right? And ours function different than the birds. We don't use our arms for flying. We can't, right? We use our arms for swinging from trees and climbing trees and collecting things, gathering things, holding children, using tools, etc. And then if you look at like the pectoral fin on the whale, still looks pretty similar. I mean, you've got the same bones, right? Like this is your the whale's upper arm bone. This is the horse's upper arm bone. Here's your upper arm bone, all coded in blue there. So it's still got some of the same structures, but those structures have different shapes because the whole limb is going to function a little bit differently. A pectoral fin in a whale isn't meant for flying. Definitely is not meant to be a structure used in collecting food or climbing a tree or hanging on to babies or what have you. In fact, the pectoral fin on a whale is pretty much non-functional. They don't move. They don't swim with their pectoral fins. They use their caudal fins for that, their tails, right? So really what the pectoral fin does on a whale is it just helps to steer a little bit. So you see that functions dramatically differently than all of these others that were helping the organism get from one place to the next, right? We see this relationship at the organismal level. And now, of course, I joke, this is totally photoshopped, right? That would be a very big individual and a very small individual. But it emphasizes a point here where if you think about how each one of these individuals might interact with their environment, it's going to be very different. The little person right here is probably not going to be very strong in comparison to the big guy, right? Probably not going to be very strong, and therefore isn't going to be able to be very forceful in its environment. But because of the size, that individual is probably a little bit more agile and a little bit faster than the big individual. So he could, run underneath these guys' arms. He could run between this guy's legs to get away. So he's going to function or interact with his environment very differently. And then the larger individual here definitely won't be agile or quick. But if you look at the body type, which is very common to sumo wrestlers, the body type is really just meant to be kind of get in the way, to be very strong, kind of to be this big block of immovable mass, so to speak. So just by looking at that individual's body, you can determine that it's going to interact or function in its environment much different than the smaller individual. And then, of course, you got my favorite, Michael Phelps, who, as you know, won like 3,677 gold medals. No, I think it was somewhere around 26 or 27. But he's an Olympic swimmer. And if you think about the sport of swimming, it's a matter of milliseconds between first place, gold, and silver, second place. And if the individuals are swimming at exactly the same pace, then they will touch that sensor at the same time, and then it will be a tie. But if an individual, for instance, has a longer torso or a longer body as a whole or longer arms, if the individuals are swimming at the same pace, right, the same speed, then the one with the longer body or longer arms is going to touch the sensor first and therefore defeat their opponent. So what's cool about Michael Phelps, well, a lot of things are cool about Michael Phelps, but one of the things is that he's got a genetic condition called Marfan syndrome. And Marfan syndrome manifests itself as a longer neck, longer arms, longer torso, longer legs, and some other things too. It can come with some heart issues as the individual ages. But my point is that Michael Phelps's body is designed or structured better to function in a watery environment or in the pool. So that's that relationship between structure.